Another season is on its way and more NFL rules are changing. Every spring, the NFL votes on new rules at the league meetings. There are a bunch of proposals from teams and the competition committee that owners then vote on. In order for the rule to actually go into effect, 2/3 or 24 out of 32 owners have to approve it. At this year's meeting, there ended up being 12 different proposals that were approved, but none as big and league altering as the banning of the hip drop tackle and the new kickoff rules. Everyone is just an old man yelling at the clouds when it comes to change. Nobody likes it, and I'm willing to bet that at least one of these rules fails. But I also believe that some of them will probably be good for the game too. The kickoff is something that the NFL has been changing a lot recently. Back in 2018, the NFL made any kick that landed in the end zone be an automatic touchback. Then in 2023, the returner was able to signal for a catch to advance to the 25-yard line. It definitely made the game a lot safer. It's pretty obvious that the kickoff could be an injury-prone play, with both teams running full steam ahead at each other downfield. The problem is that it took away a lot of the incentive to actually return the ball. As a matter of fact, 2023 had the lowest kickoff return rate in NFL history. I think ultimately those were the right calls because it did make the game a lot safer, but then again, if nobody's even returning, then what's the point of the play? So the NFL now has a new rule that was proposed by the competition committee. The ball will be kicked by the 35-yard line, but everyone else on the kicking team will line up on the opponent 35, and the opposing team will line up at their own 30 with two returners between the goal line and the 20-yard line. The returners can move at any time prior to or during the kick, but nobody else can move until the ball is fielded, and the kicker can't even pass the 50-yard line. Any kick that falls in between the goal line and the 20 has to be returned. If it ends up bouncing into the end zone, it has to be returned or down for a touchback, and that'll go out to the 20-yard line. If the ball hits the end zone and stays inbounds or is downed or even goes out of the end of the end zone, it's a touchback at the 30-yard line. Penalties from scoring plays won't carry over from kickoffs anymore, and fair catches have been completely eliminated from kickoffs. On top of all of that, you can't surprise onside kick anymore, but you still can onside kick. It has to be disclosed to the officials and can only be used twice per game by a trailing team in the fourth quarter. If you were like me and watched the XFL back in 2020, you probably have already seen the similar new kickoff rule. I mean, personally, I thought it worked out pretty well in that league, and I'm pretty excited to see it adapted to the NFL. It really felt like kickoffs just didn't matter last year. There was like zero reason to watch them, but I really hope that isn't the case anymore. Anytime we can inject action into a game that feels like it's trying to get rid of it, I'm in. This is a way to promote returning kickoffs and still help limit injuries. But clearly, limiting injuries has been the big focal point when changing the rules over the years. Now, the banning of the hip drop tackle may have been even bigger than the new kickoff rule. There are obviously a lot of people who think the league is getting softer and softer over the years, and the more tackling rules we get, the more the game changes. And now, there's no more hip drop tackles. A hip drop tackle is defined as when a defender wraps up a ball carrier and rotates or swivels his hips. Basically, the player takes his weight and drops onto the ball carrier's legs. According to the NFL, that specific technique led to lower body injuries 20 times more often than other tackles. So now it'll be a 15-yard penalty and automatic first down if a player does two things. They have to grab the runner with both hands or wrap the runner with both arms and unweight themselves by swiveling and dropping their hips or lower body and landing or trapping the runner's legs at or below the knee. I know that's a mouthful, but that's really the rule. It sounds incredibly complicated, and I'm sure it's going to be a long process to figure out what is and isn't an actual penalty. And if the history of the NFL tells us anything, it's likely we're going to get a lot of stupid penalties because of this next season. It feels like the hip drop issues definitely came to light after Mark Andrews got injured back in November, where he suffered a cracked fibula and ankle ligament injury when Logan Wilson fell on him. John Harbaugh clearly was not happy after the tackle led to Andrews' injury, but the NFLPA actually opposed banning the hip drop tackle because it would put defensive players at an impossible position, and they're probably right. I don't know how on earth the league is actually going to enforce hip drop tackles. It feels like a very slippery slope, and I'm sure it's probably going to be a disaster, at least to start. That and the new kickoff rules are the two big changes, but there are also 10 other rule changes that you need to know. One of the new rules was proposed by the Lions, and that was to protect the team's ability to be able to challenge a third time if a challenge is successful. So if a team challenges and it doesn't get overturned, they've lost the challenge. But if it does get overturned, they wouldn't just have one challenge left, they would have two. The competition committee had an amendment approved that allowed a major foul by the offense to be enforced before a change of possession when there are fouls on both teams. Usually, those would offset, but can now actually be enforced if it's a major foul. There was also the approval to make the ruling of a passer down by contact or out of bounds before throwing the ball a reviewable play. So if the ball is thrown but the passer has a knee down with contact or has a foot out of bounds, that can actually be reviewed now. One of the most interesting rule changes personally to me is the ability to allow replay review when there's clear and obvious evidence that the game clock expired before the snap. Sometimes the zeros on the field versus the zeros we get to see on our TV screen are a little bit off, and that'll allow them to go back and actually make sure the play got off in time. That'll certainly matter in some circumstances if it comes to a late field goal or last-ditch effort to score at the end of the game. Another Lions amendment was approved that will allow teams to have an unlimited number of designated for return transactions in the playoffs. I think it's a good call, just if a team is super banged up. More fun designated return talk. The competition committee had a rule approved that lets teams put up to 2 players who are on the reverse list on the last business day of final roster cuts to be designated to return. Those 2 players are going to count as 2 of the team's designations though. The emergency third quarterback rule is a newer one, and we have a bit of a change up to it. Teams can now elevate a bona fide quarterback as many times as they want from the practice squad to the active list to be an emergency quarterback. The Bills had a rule get passed that didn't really give a great explanation of how it's going to change, but nonetheless it was passed. It'll make the injury reporting rules for players who don't travel to away games competitively fairer. I'd assume it's easier for a home team to not have to report until later since there's no travel, but I didn't really see too much on this rule. There was a trial in 2023 that provided a specific Hawkeye feed in the coach's booth, and Jacksonville proposed not just using it again this upcoming season, but also using it for the entirety of the 2025 season, which ended up being approved. Finally, another interesting rule change is the movement of the trade deadline from the Tuesday after Week 8 to the Tuesday after Week 9, which was proposed by the Steelers. Essentially, the trade deadline is just getting moved back a week, which makes a ton of sense considering we now have a longer season anyway. There are obviously some big rule changes when you look at it, and who really knows what's going to happen in the future. The kickoffs are certainly going to be something to watch, as is the ban on the hip drop tackles. I guess we'll just have to wait and see, but with every big rule change, there's a period of just testing and trying to figure things out, and that's what we're about to see. So buckle up and let's see how this thing goes.